Welcome to Lore Talks, episode 1. Today we talk about Nym. I'm Elioaux Forgeraunt. I write and produce the YouTube videos for the Eorzean archives.
I'm Niniri. I mostly write stuff for the site. The articles up there are mostly written by me.
And I would argue emotional support. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm very excited about our topic today.
Yeah,
It's near and dear to
yes,
me.
yes. It very much is to me too. I am quite a lover of Tonberry, and though not to your extent, very much also the Fifth Astral era. So, this format will be I will be basically providing questions or interviewing you as someone who has a relatively decent knowledge of the topic of Nym, but not to your degree. Uh, if that sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think I know a great deal about Nym, but if I miss anything, then please leave it in the comments to the video. We're always at welcoming of suggestions.
Absolutely. Always please we love it when you engage with our content. I know that sounds like it's an algorithmic thing, but it's no, like genuinely it fuels us because we don't want to just talk into the ether. Okay. So let's start with the probably I guess easiest. What is Nym?
Right. So Nym is essentially it's a thalassocratic city-state, which put simply is a city-state that really likes ships and trade and naval ongoings and stuff like that.
So much like
Um,
Limsa.
yeah, very much like Limsa. It arose out of plainsfolk merchants who Lalafell, settling on the southern end of Vilbrand in the first 500 years of the Fifth Astral Era.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
it was originally a trading post. So similar to how the Ether Tower up in the north of Eorzean was founded as a research post and then became a city and the colony of Sharlayan. Nym was originally just a little outpost that became its own state. Um, it was a rich realm that had a lot of wealth and a lot of knowledge and a number of specific skills that allowed it to compete with much larger states like Mak and Amdapor.
It was their contemporaries.
Yeah, it was absolutely a contemporary of Mark and Amdapor. There is a lot of history to chronicle it fighting with Mark, and there are some hints that it fought with Amdapor as well. But presumably, since it was a trade state, it must have had allies or at least trading contacts.
Yeah. And a little, allusion to later. You have to assume somehow trade is how they got the plague into it in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. We can discuss that.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that soon. So then, where was Nym? Is the next question.
So, like I said, Nim's on the southern end of Vilbrand, like Limsa is, and was seemingly centered somewhat on Upper Lenosha, which is where we see most of the ruins associated with it today. But we do know that it also occupied Middle Lenosha, because Galadian Bay, which is that big sort of bay near Aleport, was once the Bay of Nym, and was where important ongoing sort of tactical engagement that Ostrom that we'll discuss later went on. Um, it occupied those two spaces because they don't touch directly. It must have then probably occupied all of the region that we call Lenosha today.
Yeah, I was going to ask because you also have some of the floating structures that exist in Outer Lenosia as well.
Yeah, I would assume that it occupies all of Lenosha, possibly more, possibly besides the really inland stuff that the kobolds live in, because they were not encroaching on the kobolds like Limsa was or is.
I was going to ask, is there anything to suggest that they might have existed as far out as Ogomoro?
I doubt it. They might have an embassy out there, because, like we'll discuss later, they had trade ties and sort of diplomatic relations with the kobolds. But we don't hear much. We know so little about Ugomoro itself that
It's surprising how little we know, both because of how we've dealt with the kobolds, but simultaneously just the fact that Vilbrand is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. We've only really explored the sort of coastal areas and then like the very slight inland of Vilbrand, but there's this huge mountain in the middle that's a massive cultural center for the kobolds, and I'd really love to see it one day.
Oh, me too. I mean, though you can, in some ways, you're not surprised when you look at things like Abelathia's spine and how little we've been to everything involving that, and how much lore there is there, or how long it took us to go to Pagothon. So then I got to this a little bit earlier, but when was Nym?
So Nym was founded around 500, around the year 500 in the fifth astral era, which was also known as the Age of Enlightenment. This was about 200 years after Amdapor started to really rise, and it's about the same time actually that Mark rose. So they're very contemporaneous with their rise. And it didn't fully collapse until the sixth Umbral era, the Calamity of Water really hit, but it did have a period of decline prior to that.
Mm, okay. So then another question is who lived in Nym, both the peoples and maybe sort of their racial makeup, if we have that information.
So pretty much all of the lore that we have, which is, I will admit, not a lot on this subject, illustrates Plainsfolk Lalafell being
Mm.
the dominant, if not only race of Nym. We can't really claim that, but there is no solid proof of another race being sort of extant in that civilization. There were sort of interestingly, earlier in the game's lifespan, there was some, and we'll discuss this maybe a little bit more later, but there were some efforts to say that the really big Tonberries, like the Tonberry King, were Rogadin, but that's not 100% supported by sort of the lore.
That would also be interesting when you look at like the King Tomberry and like assuming you buy that theory, what that then sort of implies about
Right,
why a Rogan would be king.
right. So there's actually some really fascinating lore in E2 about the King Tonberry.
Oh,
And we know who the King Tonberry was. The King Tonberry wasn't a king, it was a
oh,
high mage of Nym.
right. I
We
did
know
read
that
that entry.
Nym must have had a king because it had royal marines or it had a monarch of some kind. But the Tonberry king is essentially sort of this demented high mage who declared itself king of the Tonberries.
So we're almost looking like a sort of Vobert situation with the first,
Yeah,
where
yeah, you could say that. Um, there's a lot of interesting lore about the Tonberry king that we'll discuss a little bit later, sort of the implications on it.
awesome. So then, probably the last of some of the most basic things is why/how did Nym fall?
So this is probably the thing that we know the most about Nym. Sort of Nym's fall is fairly easily tracked back to the Nymian plague or the Green Death, whichever you want to call it. So Nym was really quite a small state, much, much less population than the other sort of two dominant states of the era. And it was, despite that, it was able to resist the sort of conquering efforts of Mark really quite ably, including sort of these vast void sent armies that they'd send over that could fly, obviously, so didn't even have to engage them on a naval front. But the marauders and the scholars managed to sort of beat them back anyway. But the story of how Mark managed to get this sort of void sent Bitoso into Nym is really quite interesting and quite clever, but also a bit comical. So there were some Nymians, I believe they were sort of traders that experienced a shipwreck and sort of landed on this island and were saved by this tribe of local Lalafell, which isn't surprising, wouldn't have been surprising. The Lalafells were and kind of are an island dwelling race at their sort of at their root.
Mm,
Um,
yeah, with the South Sea Isles and all that.
exactly, yeah. Um, and these Lalafells managed to save the Nymians, and sort of as they were rescued from the island, gave them a sort of an amphora, so like a vase of a kind, to the Nymians, who took it back to their homeland. Now, this was all sort of a very elaborate ploy by Mark, who had sort of staged this whole thing. And we know that a lot of Mark were Dunesfolk as well. They had a lot of other races in there. We know they had Hyr, for example, but we know a lot of them were Dunesfolk. So this deception would have been pretty easy for them, probably.
Yep.
So anyway, Batoso, this sort of void sent, who, according to the sort of ranking that the Eorzeans give to the void sent, wasn't particularly powerful or intelligent. It's only a sixth rank.
Yeah, it's not one of the higher rungs of and quickly, could we actually just cover the void sent rungs as a concept, just in case someone's not familiar with it?
Right, absolutely. So the scholars of Eorzea in universe have attempted to sort of codify the void center into 12 ranks. At the top is, the what's it, Cloud of Darkness and
Yes.
Skathak. Yeah, and at the very bottom are imps and gnats and all sorts of stuff like that. It's ranked on supposed to be ranked on power and intelligence, but it's sort of given this caveat that even though this is an in-universe resource, it's a very unreliable narrator because it's Eorzeans trying to gauge the void for themselves, and they're not
Yep.
really very good at it.
No, that's something they don't even understand, and they even use the void as a catch-all term to refer to such different things.
Yeah, yeah, they really are trying to sort of label things that they're not qualified to.
Yep,
But it's often fairly reliable. But in Betoso, I personally seeing its sort of feats and what it's able to do, I wouldn't put it so low.
that makes
But
sense.
anyway, so Betoso comes out of the amphora at some point, and it's able to sort of turn itself invisible, and creep around Nym, and infect people with this dark magical plague that mutates you. Um, at least for the survivors, it turns your skin green, sort of shrinks your limbs, and makes your face literally melt. It's really gruesome. Um, and creates the Tonberries, which is not what the Nymians called them. We don't know what they called them. Plague victims or something. But Tonberries is a modern title.
How modern is it within the 6th astral era?
It's post Calamity, actually, because it was adventurers in the Wanderer's Palace that gave them that title.
Right. So it must have been literally within, like, the past 5 or so years.
Must have been, yeah, yeah, somewhere around there. Um, so the Nymians sort of round up all these infected that they're terrified of them, and sort of what they represent for their civilization, and just sort of shove them in a big temple called the Wanderer's Palace, which I'm sure any player who's cleared ARR will be quite acquainted with.
The Wanderer's Palace getting its name from Oschon the Wanderer, or one of the 12.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. That's who it's a temple to. Essentially, it's a huge temple, and the Nymians are so scared that when the quarantine doesn't work, they sink the temple. That they just submerge it in water, and the plague by this point has kind of already crippled Nym, or at least very severely weakened it. But the final fall really comes at the hand of the calamity. So there's this huge tidal wave approaching Nym, and all of the rest of the land is sort of flooding at the same time. And Nim's navy weaves this so you know how arcanists are sort of they use mathematical formulae and diagrams to cast their magics. So as the ships of the Nymian navy sort of trace mathematical patterns on the Bay of Nym, they are turned into this giant sort of arcane array, sort of like hundreds and hundreds of scholars coming together to cast a really big shield. Um, and this manages to hold off the waters not long enough to save Nym, because Nym is still destroyed, but it allows the surviving citizens to flee into sort of the highlands, so maybe Ogomero or maybe just the sort of hills around it, and they survive Nym's fall.
Based on what we see with, for instance, the arc, in what, the fringes or the peaks, you have to assume that it would have had to have been some of the highest points in the land.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They would have had to go pretty high up, and that's why they needed to weave this array. It's not sort of just run inland, a mile and then you're safe. It would have been, I would have to assume, more severe than that. But Nym itself is destroyed.
And that actually brings me to one of my questions, which is Nim is referred to often as having being a floating city, and there are structures that are floating. Were those existent at the time of the calamity and before? And if so, why were those structures not able to be a safe haven from the flood?
So, first of all, to sort of tackle the was Nym floating, um, I don't believe it was at least originally floating, at least
Hmm.
not literally. If you look at Nymian architecture, almost all of it, if not all of it, is on plinths and pillars. It's all elevated. So it could be floating like the floating Babylons of Guardian,
Yeah.
floating gardens of Babylon even were floating in that they were sort of suspended. Um, but we do see floating areas in the like you said in Atalanosha.
Yeah.
They're floating on sort of aether crystals above a deep drop. Now, a theory that I've seen that I really like is that this actually literally floating area was the one that was attacked by Ozma, the Marquis superweapon, and that these floating bits are sort of what's left over.
Well, and if correct me if I'm wrong, but the crystals under them, have a blue hue at first, but they seem corrupted at their tips, which would me
Yes.
think that they are aspected in such a way that they're not necessarily natural.
Yeah, so they do have this, this blue top and this sort of orangey red bottom, which definitely could link to that. So it could be that the Ozma attack did this. It could also be that, I mean, the city lived through like two calamities. So
Right.
who knows what that could have resulted in.
Calamities make things get fucky. The
They
other thing
really
was
do.
was the floating city as we understand it existent at the time of 1.0?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Actually, the floating city that we would most know, sort of the non-floating part, the part in Bronze Lake, definitely wasn't because Bronze Lake still existed.
Yes, because the water receding is what reveals the Wonder Palace, correct?
Yes, that's right. And I don't think that the floating islands were extant in the form that they are now, at the very least. I've not seen
Right.
any pictures that resemble how they do.
Which isn't necessarily indicative of because 1.0 is 1.0. That doesn't necessarily mean they weren't existent, but it could be that perhaps the reason they're currently floating is because of the 7th Rumble calamity.
It really could be. I mean, we don't see much of Andapor at all. Gelmora's more for focusing 1.0. So, like you said, it's really not indicative of much.
Yeah,
If Nym was literally floating or could literally float even before the calamity of water, I don't think that would have saved it. So, like we said, the Wondrous Palace was sunk intentionally, and whereas sort of Mark and Andapor were flooded in a more conventional sense, Nym was hit by a tidal wave. So,
mm,
even if it could float, it may have just been destroyed outright.
yeah, and from what we see of the structures, whether by age or by, water, they're also somewhat damaged, and also it's not like it's a literal city, it's not you're not seeing Charlayan in the sky, you're seeing some, enough structures for a jumping puzzle.
Yeah, it's pillars and it's broken walkways. There's very little there. And the only reason that the Wondrous Palace is so intact, and we'll discuss this more later, is because it had a magical barrier around it.
Right. Then on that, let's talk about Nymian sort of culture to start alluding to and getting towards maybe some of their more specific practices like the scholar.
Right, right. So we don't know a huge amount about Nymian culture. So we know they were thalassocratic. They had lots of ships and sort of based their society around that, similar to Limsa, but they were a bit more mercantile than piratical. They appreciated academia and took the arcanist techniques that were already sort of around on the South Sea Isles and elevated them into the scholar that we see today. Their sailors were rowdy and violent, like many sailors are. Their martial arms was the Royal Marines. So, like we said, they had to have a king or a monarch, and they were some of the most elite troops of the era. Probably, in my opinion, I would say the most elite troops, but obviously there were much fewer of them. Their mage community was organized because it had high mages, so it had to have some sort of organizational structure. They had extensive trading and political ties with the kobolds.
I guess let's touch on that real quick then. So the Nym had a very good relationship with the kobolds. Now this is well before, the notion of beast tribes is existent. That doesn't come for hundreds and hundreds of years later.
Right.
But it wasn't like everyone was still getting along with their, so-called beast tribe neighbors. So what was it that allowed for them to get along with them so well?
So the best part to start here is just by starting to talk about Oschon,
Mm.
the patron god of Nym. So Um, the Nymians, unlike the Limpsons, always wanted to be allied to the kobolds. They settled their sort of trading post there to trade with the kobolds. Obviously, the kobolds have vast minimal mineral wealth and the ability to smith it, but they worship Ocean the Wanderer. Nym does. It's one of the two gods of wind, like Limlayan is, who is the future god of Limsa. He's a god of wanderers and mountains and vagrants and all of that. Um, and he's actually a pretty mysterious god. So we don't know much about him. Even sort of the creation myth that we have says that the gods don't know where Ocean came from. He just appears one day. Um,
The only one that I feel like is probably more mysterious is Ralger, who literally just shows up in the narrative.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, Oschon is lovers with, I think it's Limlaen, isn't it?
It
But
is
can't, yeah, right. But can't settle down with her because
Minfina,
he's
isn't it?
always, it's always Menfina. Okay, all right then.
I only say
Um,
that because I feel like I will double check that while you continue talking.
okay, so, well, either way, whoever he's in love with, he can't settle down with because he's always wandering around sort of the world. He's actually pretty close to Hydaelyn. So if you're an Ishgard fan, Oshon's, in there. It was him that sort of took her from being essentially a divine terrorist and sort of redirected her to being a warrior. Um, and he also created Nalthal, who he considers his brother, out of magma. There's various sorts of sort of other stuff that we can discuss, and I'm sure we'll get to that in our God series about Oschon. But essentially, Oschon is a god of mountains. So the kobolds also worship a god of mountains, Ogomoro, and sort of Titan, who is a manifestation of the heart of Ogomoro. So they have pretty good common ground there, and Encyclopedia Eorzean notes that that was really the crux behind what allowed them to get on with each other.
The question I guess then that brings to my mind is, do any other nation states in actually in recorded history really, but especially in like the fifth astral, like we don't really know that Andapur had a patron deity, do we? I mean, we could
Oh, so Amdapor we do know, but Mac we don't. Amdapor worship Nofika, same as Gridania does.
Oh, okay, cool. I was struggling to find information like that. That is good to know. It wouldn't be surprising if, Mach either didn't have one or if, they almost just worshipped Void Sent at some point as their, they
Yeah, so my gauge on Mark is that they probably didn't have one at the end, but we know that each of the 12 city states did have one at the beginning of the era, because each one worshipped one of the 12.
Okay, so even in EE1 I know they kind of reference that each one has it, but they never allude to what that Mach's patron.
No, I mean, you could, think about Ralga sort of as a god of thaumaturges and stuff like that through his destructive magic, but we really don't know very much.
Yeah, you could even like guess Nalthal if we're seeing Nafka come back up for Gridania. It wouldn't be
Yeah,
crazy to think.
yeah,
Um
you absolutely could.
uh the wonderful life of speculation where you can make somewhat reasonable guesses, but you can't know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you want to get into really wild speculation, you could discuss which god Scala worshipped, and we have no knowledge of that at all, or ability
Oh
to gauge.
Lord, I hadn't even thought about that. Oh God, not why must you do this to me? Um, so in that vein, then we've talked about both, the magical abilities and stuff, but let's get more specifically into scholars and their role both in Nym and how that was an evolution of arcanism.
Right. Okay. So actually, the path from sort of arcanists to scholars is really interesting because it sort of involves, and this is part of being into FFXIV lore. They always pop up. It involves Alec.
It was Alec all along.
Yeah. So we know that Allergan's innovated on the scholar gear page, actually the scholar weapon page in EU2 tells us this. We know that the scholars sort of began as arcanists, and then Alec sort of innovated on their techniques, and then Nym seems to have sort of elevated that into scholar, sort of the modern scholar.
Hmm.
Um, and it makes sense because the Fifth Astral Era was a time of magic. That's what really mattered to all of its city states, or at least all of its successful city states. Nim's low population means that they can't just throw mages away, that they'll run out of them too quickly and they'll be destroyed. But they found a workaround. They put their sort of mages as supportive roles instead of sort of, what the black mage you might think of, like throwing fireballs in the front lines,
Right. And you can
and
see
not
that
moving out of
existent
the ley
in
lines.
game. You can see that existent in game by the fact that, you have something like Summoner that's DPS, but Scholar is a healer.
Exactly right. So the Nymians had their scholars healers and buffing the Marines essentially, and we can assume that perhaps this path rose out of necessity more than anything else. The first scholars probably were just arcanists, but we have a few sort of milestones on the road. We know that they became tacticians and strategists on the battlefield. That became one of their responsibilities, and they couldn't heal and buff while doing that at the same time, at least not to a full extent. So they learned to sort of summon and control etheric constructs called the fairies, which we see today. So they were essentially commanders as much as they were support mages, which actually gave them the title of scholar because they would study tactics and strategy and all of that. I think it's mentioned that they're sort of the fact that much of their clothing is sort of brown green hints at their military origin. Um,
Mm.
and the original artifact armor actually has medals on it, which again,
Oh,
you can see that. We also know that there was a school for scholars because there, I think it was the Stormblood set has a mortarboard, and one of the Encyclopedia Eorzeas notes that this hints at there being a school for them to learn, sort of an organized institution of learning for scholars.
which makes sense that you have an entire civilization with them as, if not a linchpin, a major player, and it would just and literally the title of scholar. It's not crazy to think.
Yeah, absolutely.
The I guess kind of correlating that then into where it goes, why were scholars unable to and widely why were healers unable to contend with the plague when they seem to have
Right.
such great ability within healing?
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And the plague is, frankly, really weird. So we know that it warps the Lalafels, but the fact that it's called the Green Death, despite this not really being mentioned, I don't think sort of implies that a lot of the people who got it died straight up before
Mhm.
becoming Tonberries. And I don't think we have an exact answer, or at least none comes to my mind for why they couldn't cure it. Um, Perhaps it was simply the unique nature of the plague. Bisoto is sort of like turning itself invisible and creeping around Nym,
Right.
and infecting people with some odd plague. I mean, you could always draw ties to the artificial void scent that we see in Shadowbringers. You see an individual turning people through sort of magic slash alchemic solutions into sort of artificial void scent.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe that's like halfway to what the Tomberries are. Maybe they are being sort of etherically starved and turned into these different creatures than they were before.
Right. Well, and you can also imagine that, I mean, one, with how complicated Aether is, but if you're trying to cure a viral infection with, antibiotics, you're not gonna do very well. So if they don't understand the origin of it particularly well, they may not just have the tools to contend with it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it gives some really weird things to Tomberries. They can channel their emotions into sort of physical strikes, which seems to be a product of the plague.
So that actually what exactly is the rancor?
So we have very little lore in it, but from what we see, it is literally them channeling their emotions into some sort of magical attack.
Mm,
We don't know much more than that. I mean, sort of the emotions of a spellcaster are always really important to their spellcasting, but these seem to almost come out of nowhere, these techniques. And the magic with the Tonberries doesn't stop there. Um, so the High Mage, the King Tonberry that we discussed earlier, um, it essentially went mad when it was sane. All the Tonberries were sane at first, and then when the Wondrous Palace is sunk, this Tonberry, and I assume many others, feels just betrayed, and is absolutely incensed and falls into such a deep rage that it somehow corrupts all of the other Tonberries, turns them all insane at once, which is, or at least almost all of the other Tonberries, which is very odd. It suggests sort of like a connection between all of them,
yeah,
almost.
like a somewhat pseudo hive mind.
Yeah,
Which I guess if you think of the plague as almost like bits of the void scent in a way does connect them.
yeah, definitely. I mean, the Voighten are, you could discuss them for 1,000 years. They're so varied and so diverse in their sort of traits.
Fingers crossed for a 13th shard, either expansion or just content. Just give me something, please.
Oh, that would be extremely cool.
Yeah. Actually, so speaking of both the amount of time and the weirdness of Tomberry, What exactly is their longevity, and why do they seem to basically be eternal at this point?
So, um, with Sarita and that lot, it's pretty much impossible to deny that the Tomberries have lived for thousands and thousands of years. They either have a really long lifespan or they're immortal. We don't know why, but if they are sort of pseudo void sent, then that would make a lot of sense because the void sent do seem to be immortal. You know, Cloud of Darkness has been around for way longer than Nym was. So Bitosa's influence could have caused that. Additionally, something interesting is that the Wondrous Palace was magically sealed, right?
Mm,
And we know that Alag was able to magically seal facilities so that things inside them did not age at
right.
all. So that's why we see living things like Phlegethon and all that. And we know that Nym learned from Allagan Arcanistry in some way. So maybe they picked up this secret or like a version of it, and they're not actually super long lived. They've just been in sort of pseudostasis. It could be either
Yeah, no,
or
that
something
would
else.
make a lot of sense. I'm sure, if we could find, I'm sure there might be text in the game that describes, "Oh, I've been, awake for so long," from one of the Tomberries or something that, but other than that, I mean, there's no, I think that's incredibly reasonable speculation. In terms of talking about the Wanderer's Palace, but now more Wanderer's Palace hard, the one of the things we see also, and this is more specifically to do with the Sixth Astral era and also, the area of Upper Lenosia, is the Mamool that show up
Yeah.
there. So what exactly is going on with that?
So, like you said, this the Mamool aren't really linked to them at all. Like you said, they're more of a modern thing. It's sort of a mercenary band from the New World, comprised of Mamool, as you would expect from the New World. They're called the Silver Scales, and they're led by this two-headed Mamool. All sort of two-headed Mamool are raised from birth to lead, to be kings or chiefs or military leaders, whatever you want to sort of assign to them, and this group just sort of moved into the palace in order to use it as a base and to enslave the Tomberries and make them sort of work as enforced labor for them, which is really rough if you think about it. The Tomberries are like, we just got our sanity back and now we're slaves.
Actually, that makes me question, why don't the Tomberry seem to leave the Wanderer's Palace or start to engage with the rest of Eorzea proper?
That's a really interesting question. So we know that their sanity regaining is sort of a gradual process. Sarita tells us it will take a little while. But they seem to be mostly there by the time of hard mode. I don't want to say dev oversight, so let's say that they just feel safe there. I mean, these are people who would presumably have the most hardcore case of PTSD in the history of the world. So
Oh, that's so apt. Well, and also, you can look at how Eorzeans, classify different creatures and stuff, and you could absolutely be worried that if you walk outside that palace, you're about to get got by, any of the marauders of Limsa, or I mean, which was literally their prerogative in the, early quest line.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and plus you see, there's a few hunts that are Tonberry around sort of the Wondrous Palace. And they are mentioned as terrorizing the local communities. Obviously, this was before they got the sanity back, so the people probably just weren't very welcoming of them.
Yeah, so but maybe in future days we at some point could see that start to change a little bit, but I think, yeah, like a lot of things from ARR and, other earlier elements, it's not surprising to see that maybe things take a little bit of time to change. Maybe at some point, if we exit the time bubble, that's something that we could see in the future.
God, I would love to get some time bubble X thing and some decent timelining in this game, but
Somewhere between 2 to 5 years is our best guess.
yeah,
But here's hoping that, post end, that's okay. We have that era. That era is set. Here are these dates for that. Oh, please, 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 please.
that would be
Um,
amazing.
I mean, if nothing else, we will use pubescent Elizin as our yardstick of how much time has passed.
Oh God, yeah, that is certainly something that the community has to do.
Yep, yep. So getting back down to maybe some of the final questions, which are things like, why Oschon as for Nym? Why not someone like Limlane, the navigator, and even more specifically, someone like Thaliak, who's the scholar?
Right. So this is my favorite question actually, because the moment I saw it, I just had this burst of sort of like thoughts on it. So the
Awesome.
game obviously gives us no explicit information on this, but I think it's pretty easy to come up with a few reasons that we can sort of group together into one sort of bigger reason. So the first could be that it's simply they worshipped Oschon back on their islands. They come from the southern islands, which could be volcanic islands and could feature mountains prominently. Um,
Oh, of course. That makes so much sense.
Yeah. Secondly, Vilbrand is an island, but it's a mountainous one. So settling there could have simply influenced them to worship a mountain god.
Right, and
As could the presence.
that would have existed well before the scholar as a role would have even existed, so
Oh
of
yeah,
course.
definitely. And the presence of the kobolds also means that for Nym, it's extremely profitable for them to worship a mountain god. And I don't want to be that cynical about it. I'm sure they worshipped Oschon before that, but Oschon allowed them
If it
to
works, it
trade with the
works.
kobolds. Yeah, exactly.
Dunes folk may be descendants of Mach, but, you look at some of the choices they make around trade, and you maybe some things are consistent across, clans.
Yeah. So Ocean's also a god of wind, just like Lemlin is.
Mm,
So, and obviously, although water is important to sailing, the wind is, the sort of the presiding aspect of a sailor. It's what pushes the wind into your sails. And
right, otherwise you're not going anywhere.
exactly. And this sort of final reason's my favorite, but again, I think all of them grouped together maybe is a better one than any single one. So Nym is founded essentially by migratory traders, right? These people who left their homeland behind to seek a new one. And Ocean's a god of wanderers and vagrants. So these are people
Oh.
without a homeland who are wandering the oceans. So maybe they look to him as sort of, well, we're wanderers, we're essentially vagrants. This is our new homeland.
Oh, that's so lovely. I love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, that is definitely my favorite reason that I could think of.
Okay, that is thank you. Like, because many of these things I had already somewhat answered for myself, be it through explicit information or like, okay, that makes, general sense. But
Yeah.
that one specifically, I was like, yeah, it follows, but that last reason I hadn't even considered, and that adds so much flavor, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
So, do you have any sort of final points that maybe we didn't get around to that you'd like to cover real quick?
Final points. Well, something that I noticed that I really like about, and we didn't manage to get into this too much, but the designers really sort of put their thought into Nym, and by this I mean they have architectural through lines in all of their structures, a lot of water features and a lot of aqueducts, and weirdly, a lot of inverted pillars.
Yeah.
All throughout their structures, you see pillars with a really thin base and a wider top. And the Wanderer's Palace is also this. It's a very thin base and a wider top. And I just sort of appreciate that effort by the devs to sort of give this cultural impression of even what their architecture looked like.
Even as far back as 2.0, you can't accuse them of not giving it their all.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, okay, actually, this may ruin something for some people, or I may just be crazy. But if you go into the Wanderer's Palace, it's over by I am forgetting the name of the hot springs, but the entrance to it is there, and the
Yeah.
little like underwater gate area that you enter to go in is there. However, when you do that, in the background should be like the main structure that is the center of of Bronze Lake. But when you look back, it's not that structure. But as you go in and you look up, you see that structure, even though you're facing the
Yes.
exact wrong direction,
Yeah.
the literal 180 direction. And it, it's. I'm sorry if I've ruined any of your experiences with Wanderer's Palace now, but it just like notice that, and I don't know if maybe late in the dev cycle they like shifted things around or what happened with that, but it catches my eye every time.
That is a good point, actually. That there is this, you sort of, the way they've laid it out in the dungeon is you go in through this sort of like, I don't want to say lobby, but this sort of like outer
Yeah,
complex, and then you arrive at this big sort of inverted shape. And yeah, I've never thought about it, but wow, that must have just been an oversight then, unless you sort of like row your way around the back of the structure.
yeah, except for if you and this isn't fair because flying didn't exist, but if you fly around it or you look from either side of the lake, there's no entrance to it. And also you can see the little like uh portcullis entrance that you
Yeah,
go in on the like little area where you like first meet I'm forgetting his name, but the Tonberry from the Scholar Quest.
Oh, Cerrito
Burrito,
Carrito.
yeah. You can you can see where you enter, and it's right where the, like, actual, duty finder thing is. So it's like, unless
Wait,
it's com
really?
yes. Yeah, it's very odd. And I'm
That's
sure it was just
wild.
yeah, it's either just an oversight, and also if you, like, go there, if you go to the portcullis, that's when the title for where you are switches to the Wanderer's Palace. So it's literally
Wow.
it it's very, very strange, but again, I'm certain it's just either an oversight or a we had to put it somewhere, or maybe even they originally wanted you to be able to ferry out to the center, or,
Right, yeah,
any
because
number of
when you
things.
get there's a when you get into the dungeon, there's a boat behind you that you've sort of
Right.
rowed your way in on, so that would make sense.
And it's just it's one of those little interesting things that it either is a 2.0 artifact or there is an explanation and who knows. But, I just when collecting footage or doing work, every so often you're paying so close attention that you realize something like, "Wait a second, this does not work in 3D space at all." One thing I do love though is Oschon's Stone, the Wanderer's Stone. If you fly up to, like, the edge of Upper Lenosia right before you can get into Outer Lenosia, you can
Mhm.
actually see the stone and everything, like, even though
Oh,
you're
that's
not
cool.
in the map.
That is pretty
Um
cool.
And just a lot of lovely little details. All the when that's the thing is like when it's a major 3D space thing, I usually assume it's a they knew, but they like had to just make a choice because to make things work.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I mean, as we know, 2.0 is, like, kind of half zip tied together.
It's held together with duct tapes, gum, and prayers.
It definitely is, and I mean, they did an amazing job with what they had to deal with, but,
The fact that it's half as good as it is in the face of a 2-year dev cycle while maintaining 1.0 is, you know, just insane.
another side thing that I like to think about Nym is, so we all know on the Lalafall's home island, they're eaten by big birds, right? It
Yeah.
sucks for them and everything. But it seems that that didn't change for them too much when they came to Nym. They built this extremely cool society with, like, elite warriors and sort of academic institutions, and then there was a giant eel that used to eat them, apparently.
You train all your life just to get got by nature again.
Exactly. The eel of Nym, which is a fishing thing that you can pull up, are apparently small versions of this, and the archaeologists in the universe found, like, a stele, like a pillar with some
Mhm,
pictures and
yep.
writing on it that described this giant eel eating Nymians, and how it was like a terror of Nym, and I just find that extremely funny.
I mean, I find that, sad, funny, and also incredibly apt for, the civilization that it was. And
Yeah,
it also if we ever go to the South Sea Islands, which, I wouldn't be surprised, or even just at any point dealing with the Indigo Deep, I'm like, "Oh, there's gonna be some sea monster stuff going on."
yeah, it's a pretty messed up sea, right?
Yeah.
I think we could see the South Sea Islands maybe. I mean, we're going kind of close to that in Endwalker, not too
Mhm.
far away.
Well, and if we I know it's not looking at the globe, it's not exactly that Mericidia is super close to them, but if we ever do have a Mericidia, style expansion, which, is basically inevitable, um, you'd have to think that that wouldn't be a bad stopping point.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely have to imagine so. Like, you know how we stop off on the way to some of the destinations in Stormblood, how we stop off at
Yeah,
the
like
ship,
the Siren
the
Song
old
Sea too.
prison up there. Yeah,
Absolutely, I know, I think the future is it's a completely different subject, but the future is bright in terms of expansions. I've seen some people be like, "Yeah, I don't know where we're gonna go next." I'm like, "Mericidia, New World, Shards, Dragonstar," like,
yeah. I
wherever
mean, I
Ultima's
completely
from.
agree. I completely agree. It just there is some really amazing places to go.
Yep.
And don't be disappointed, all of you Allegan fans, because there are Mamool in Circus Tower, so we can find Allegan stuff in the New World too.
Well, and if you've played Boja, you know that now just everywhere is going to be fair game for any kind of Halligan monstrosity.
Yeah.
Oh man, okay, just as a quick side tangent, this may even get cut. I am so excited to have Ilsabard geographically mapped.
Oh my god, yes.
Oh,
The more that we can get the map done, and there's some really awesome people out there in the community who sort of like clearly label the maps, which is a huge use because they're kind of opaque. But having sort of a finished map of the three continents, or at least most of the three continents, is going to be so useful.
yep. Well, and even just, like, things like, okay, I know Gimlet Dark, I know Whirlet, I know Bozja, I know Zadnor, I know Garlemald, but I don't know, does Zadnor is that basically you go Zadnor is all the way up to bordering or Garlemald, or is it like, no, there's a bunch of other major areas? Now, the fact that there's mountainous regions in the central zones and, like, how Mikote moved around makes me assume that there's more regions within Ilsabard, but
I would have to imagine so, right? Because I mean, how much of Garlemald's borders is true Garlemald? Because they were supposed to be pretty small, their territories. This is all stuff that we need to find out, and that I'm just so excited to find out.
that feeling when you're the kind of person where you see an expansion and your biggest hype is for maps.
Yeah.
Just
I
I
mean,
remember freaking seeing Thavnir and going just screaming just like, "Yes! Finally!"
oh yeah, Favnir is a huge thing. I mean, there's some really cool lore. I mean, we have only very fragmentary lore, but there's some really cool lore on Rads at Han, how they have these sort of like decorative knights, almost these knights in really decorative armor who do sort of like dance parades and stuff. It just
Yep.
sounds really cool.
Well, and how all of it ties into other things, like even the Matanga and, like, the steppe.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking the other day about this is another tangent, but if I could ask the devs one question, it would be which of the 12 did Scala worship, just to watch them sort of like scrabble and try to make something up on the spot.
See, I literally have 2 different documents, one for Yoshi B questions and one for Koji questions. Um,
uh,
so I guess to bringing things to a close then, what is the legacy of Nym? What is the ultimate legacy into modern days?
right, so the legacy of Nim has been somewhat impaired by the fact that when the wave struck and destroyed Nim, most of the survivors of it went back to the South Sea Islands. So there wasn't sort of a contiguous civilization there. In the same way that, Alamigo is kind of a contiguous civilization for Amdapor and Mac and stuff like that. And obviously Belidaya and Uldar. But Operation Maelstrom gives its name to the Maelstrom, the Grand Company of Limsa and one of the really defining political groups of the Sixth Era. Um, Nim's ruins are pretty enduring cultural relics, and obviously the scholars, while they didn't survive the fall of Nym, the Warrior of Light and a few of their allies possess the discipline, and their tradition, through our own choices as players, shapes current events pretty significantly.
So even though their legacy is much more of in sense, a ghost compared to something like Mach or Amdapor, it is no less important.
Yeah, exactly. I'd definitely say that. And I mean, I have this vision in my head of us getting to go to Ogomoro or the deeper Kobold place now that we're friends with them, and like seeing a Nymian statue or a Nymian relief on the wall. That would just like blow my mind.
That would be so lovely. The amount of detail that's put into things, I think it is not unreasonable to hope for something like that and to potentially get it.
Yeah, I agree completely.
I mean, you wanna think about the level of detail, just remember that Y'shtola has, what is it? Spell, ley-lined symbols on the bottom of her shoes.
Oh yeah, I mean the care that the team puts in is just really incredible.
Just truly lovely. Okay, then, I think that about wraps it up for our first inaugural episode. I think this went rather well.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I'm sure that we'll hear from the viewers how it went, but hopefully they enjoy it.
I definitely think they will. I know if nothing else I did, which makes, the time worthwhile. I
Yeah,
think we'll definitely start out by getting to a lot of those 5th Astral Era topics because, I mean, just the impact of the 5th Astral Era on the 6th is, incalculable, and yet
yeah,
it's all too easy to not know. It's all too easy to run Amdapor, Lost City, and Keep and not know it and be like, "Wait, what's Amdapor?" And yet it's pivotal.
yeah. It's absolutely hugely important. I mean, uh, every civilization in our era stems from the War of the Magi. You know, Ishgard was founded by sort of refugees from central Eorzea who worshipped Helone. Now, don't get me started on that because then start thinking about a possible Helone worshipping civilization in the fifth. But uh, the impact of the War of the Magi and the things surrounding it are just colossal.
Literal jobs come from that. You have black mage, you have white mage, you have red mage. Many. Yeah, even just like even on a mechanical level, even if you don't care about lore, which if you don't care about lore, I'm not sure why you're listening to this. Um, Even just on a mechanical level, a lot of things only exist because of those things.
Yeah, I mean, paladins, Belladaya wouldn't have existed if not for
Right,
Mark. You know, you could
right.
really, I mean, pretty much any of the job besides summoner, really, I suppose, can draw some kind of route back to the arrow.
Okay, well then, thank you so much for talking. This has been lovely.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. We'll definitely do more of these.
100%. And with that, have a lovely day, everyone.
Yeah, have a great day.
This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday. And comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.